I now tell my students, I will be dead and gone when you're 80 years old, but really my goal now for you is that you are an 80-year-old someday who can look back at a life well lived where you loved the right things in the right order. You loved God and your family and your neighbors.
Well, hello and welcome to Reframing Education, the show exploring education with Christ at the centre. My name is Johnny Thomas.
And I'm Will Mortimer. Today's episode is Education as Formation. And we're delighted to be joined by Mrs Robyn Burlew. So, Robyn, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Robyn, you're head of upper school at Veritas in Richmond, Virginia, having arrived there as academic dean in 2014. Before that, you were upper school principal at Covenant Christian Academy in Pennsylvania. You have an MEd in educational leadership, and you sit on the national board of the Alcuin Fellowship, a group of scholars seeking Christian educational renewal. So you're approaching education as an educational leader. We'll have a range of listeners today, school leaders, also teachers, parents, church leaders, many others as well. Why is it important to keep the question of the purpose of education so central, whoever we are?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think that whenever we forget a purpose, we can veer off the trail in a host of different ways. I remember when my father was teaching me to drive, he said, watch the horizon and you will go straight down the road. And I think that the same is true when we're talking about something like education. If we take the long view of what the purpose of education is, and for us here at Veritas, that is the formation of a fully flourishing human being, a person who will go ahead and live a good life and be able to look back at a life well lived. And if we forget that that's the purpose of education, if we get too short-sighted, we will tend to meander. That keeps us from forgetting why we're here on any given Tuesday and helps us to maybe sift through a lot of different good options. It helps us to choose what to do, what's most important with our students on a day-to-day basis.
Robyn, you've given us there a definition, fully flourishing human beings as your aim, as your purpose. Is that the answer to the question that you would have given very early on in your teaching career? Has that been developing, shaping over the years? What have been some of the influences on you?
Sure. I think, like probably most of us raised in the 20th century, I would have given a much more narrow answer to that, say 30 to 40 years ago when I was first starting as an educator. I would have had a focus on university, the next stage of education. I don't think I would have had that long view.
It's almost like the time frame has changed from how you score when you're 16 to who you are when you're 60.
That's right. That's right. I now tell my students that I will be dead and gone when you're 80 years old, but really my goal now for you is that you are an 80-year-old someday who can look back at a life well lived where you loved the right things in the right order. You loved God and your family and your neighbors, and you loved them in a proper order. So that's, they laugh. They can't envision themselves as 80 years old, but of course we know it goes faster than you can imagine.
Full phrase to leave your students with, that you would love the right things in the right order. That's great. We have a standing question on the show, which is called The Good Book and A Good Book, where we ask guests if they have a particular Bible passage that has shaped their approach to education or some way shaped their thinking, but also a book that's not the Bible that's maybe influenced you. So over to you.
Sure. I would say as an educator, I would choose the book of Proverbs as having changed the way I've approached my work. For a lot of years, I had a practice of reading one chapter of Proverbs each day. And so each month you read through. And I realized that there was really a gold mine of ways to think about life with other human beings, and especially in my role as an upper school principal with teenagers, dealing with some of their struggles, their misbehaviors, helping their parents to navigate those kinds of things, helping teachers to navigate with students. So, for instance, spending a lot of time thinking about answer a fool according to his folly, and then don't answer a fool according to his folly. We find both of those things in the Proverbs. And so you realize as a teacher, I have to be discerning here. Should I answer this misbehavior right now, or should I not? As administrators, choosing a gentle answer, it's not a guarantee, right? Not every soft answer turns away wrath, but it sure does go a long way. Even with parents, as they're trying to figure out what's going on with their children, the proverb that the first man's story seems right until the second man comes along. Let's just withhold some judgment right now until we find out more of what's going on. Has been so helpful as an administrator, but also helpful as I talk with parents. Just be patient. You don't have to have the answer right now. You can wait. And I think over time, the Proverbs have really changed and helped the way I approach my work. So I would say that for my scripture passage, I encourage young administrators to take up the practice. Just read the Proverbs over and over. There will be a wealth of things that you find. I have a journaling Bible here in my office, and I have marked verses according to topics in my Proverbs.
If there's any new listeners today, we had a previous episode that was all about Proverbs from a head here in the UK who's really made Proverbs some of his life study, and so that's the one that people might enjoy. And your good book that you'd love to draw our attention to. Sure.
I think as we've been kind of focused on formation, I would say the book that started me down this path was Desiring the Kingdom by James K.A. Smith. Together with my faculty at the school I was at in Pennsylvania, we read it together as a faculty and just let it shape our brainstorming and maybe our dreaming together with one another about what was possible with these students. And the ideas that we are so shaped by our habits. It's a two-way street. It's what we believe and what we think affects how we act, but how we act and what we do also then shapes the way we think. And so we began paying a lot better attention to the practices of our school and not just on the content of our classes. It was pivotal in the way we began to think about education in our K-12 school.
So a couple of his big insights. One is anthropological, that human beings, we're not simply thinking beings, but actually loving beings, worshipping beings. And our hearts can be shaped and influenced by our habits, by daily rituals, by the rhythms of life, and that often those things are unseen, that they're unexamined, that they're under the surface, and all the more powerful for that. You mentioned there that it gave you a desire to dream about what was possible and reflect on your own practice as a school. I wonder if you could give us a bit of a taste about where those conversations then went. What did it make you feel that you were doing well already, and what opportunities did it open up for you as you look to the future?
Sure. I think one of the things that all of us bring some assumptions about how we're going to do school together. We assume, at least in the United States, that the school's going to have bells in the hallways to tell you when class ends and when the next class starts, and it'll be very efficient. And reading Jamie's book started us thinking, well, wait a minute. If we're talking about what kind of human beings these are, some of those systems are treating them almost like we're in a factory together, where the whistle blows and your shift starts, and the whistle ends and your shift ends. And students don't care if the teacher's in the middle of a sentence. If the bell rings, right, they're out of their seats. And so we didn't want to be that kind of place. We want a teacher, another human, to begin class, and we want human to end class and have closure with their students, not just a material bell in the hallway ringing. Another thing that we thought about is how we eat together, the fellowship and the conversation that happens over meals. A lot of schools, to be more efficient, have short lunch periods where you eat quickly so you can get back to the real work of school in class. And we've chosen to make a long lunch. Our students have long lunches where you can eat in a leisurely way and you can have time to talk with your friends, talk with your teachers, sit at picnic tables and enjoy a lovely day. Maybe play a pickup game of Frisbee or soccer with your friends before you go back to class. And that's a really human way of interacting. I think one of the things that we want to do is, C.S. Lewis says that education is old birds teaching young birds to fly. And so what does it mean to be human isn't just being efficient. And so it is those conversations, being together, eating together, passing one another in the hallways and having time to ask how the other person is doing, that we didn't want to be like a factory, I think is the bottom line of that we're forming humans and the systems we have in place matter.
Can I ask, with the bells, what happened? Did you get rid of them? Did you replace them with something else? And are there any other practical ways in which you sort of transitioned your school from that factory model into something that's a little bit more humane?
Yes, great question. We got rid of bells and we went to a longer transition between classes. So giving our students, here on our campus at Veritas, we have multiple buildings. So we have 10 minutes between classes for students to move. We don't have clocks in our classroom. The teacher's watch is the beginning and end of class. I think it's made a real difference.
One of the things that I was struck by was the use of question-answer, really kind of catechisms at the beginning of every lesson, really, as far as I could tell. Did that come in later? Is that part of this same project as formation, as habits? Give our listeners a bit of a taste of the reasoning behind that and what that looks like across the school day. Yes,
the teachers have developed what they call a classroom catechism. Most of our teachers start their lessons with those. It's a way, it does a couple different things. For students coming in each day, it gives them a pattern of beginning each class that both contains some questions and answers that are repetitive, that are about the class itself. So it might be some quotes from some of the literature books they're going to read during the year. But it also will contain some scriptures, some prayer at the end that will focus them towards their work that they're going to be doing. I would say these class catechisms flowed out of both a desire to have a structured beginnings, because when you do away with your bells, you've got to figure out, how do you begin? So if you think about a church service, it would be the call to worship, right? The church service is going to have some way that is the signal, the collective communal signal that we've begun something here. And we wanted to have that same sense of the class having a beginning. And it also is a way, students have just come from their conversations in the hallway or at lunch, or maybe they've just had choir, and it's a way for them to also get ready to do history together or to do science together, a way to focus. They've been really effective.
Just but before we pick up on that a bit more, some might be listening feeling that it sounds very wonderful, but might feel a bit divorced from our own context or the schools that are around us. And let's take the opportunity to mention another book called Habits of the Household, which takes a lot of these insights about rhythms and how habits can be heart-shaping, but actually applies them in the home, and particularly for parents. We'll put that in the show notes and and they can enjoy that.
That's great. Yes, I think we underestimate the power of our daily routines and the way that they shape us as individuals, but also our relationships with those around us. It gives us a great scaffolding for our relationships to happen both in the school and in the home. It's wonderful.
You mentioned the book Desiring the Kingdom by Jamie Smith and the transformative effect it had on you and your fellow educators in Pennsylvania. Some years have passed since that first reading. What has been some of the fruit that you've seen from this shift?
At least for myself, the idea of virtue was very narrowed from what I understand it to be now. My whole view of virtue as something that we're aiming at in our students, I think virtue has been truncated to maybe just moral issues where honesty or whatever the virtue is. But when you think of virtue as the excellencies of our human capabilities, and those include spiritual virtue, faith, hope, and love, but also intellectual virtue, that the capability that we have as human beings to reason and to make connections, to become wise, we can become intellectually virtuous also through our habits. And especially at a school, the home and the church are also going to be forming virtue in our students. But the school has a particular responsibility to be developing the intellectual virtue of our students. And I think the fruit of Desiring the Kingdom all these years later is probably a much fuller understanding of how what we do together and what I do forms habits and ways of thinking, so that if we model for our students and have them practice these habits of the intellectual virtues, it's also forming them from the outside in addition to us kind of overtly telling them content and how to think about certain things and giving them things to think about. So I think it's a powerful two-way street that has just become richer and richer over the years since reading that book initially.
One of our hopes with this Reframing Education podcast is to catalyze conversation. We really want to get believers thinking and talking graciously about education. And we think that books are a wonderful stimulus to that end. So I'm excited to say that we host an online book group, and the purpose of the book group is to help people to connect and discuss notable works on education from Christian authors, both ancient and modern. We aim to make them short and manageable, so maybe a small book or perhaps even just a chapter. You can find more details about this under our Support the Show in the show notes by following the Patreon link. And the first modern book that we'll discuss will be something from the works of James Smith.
Just to pick up on the title of the book, Robyn, Desiring the Kingdom, he describes how where all of us are aiming at something. It's where you began the conversation today. We're all looking at a vision of the good life, or aiming at some kind of kingdom. Is that something that you think deliberately about as a school? Do you seek to cast a vision of Christ's kingdom, for a vision of the good life? Every school, whether we realise it or not, we're all aiming at something, aren't we? We all have a vision of what the good life is. You're in a Christian school. Right. What does that look like as you try and cast the vision of the good life? That's
right. Our mission is to be Christ-centered classical education. And so we do believe that Jesus is Lord over everything that we're studying, not in simplistic ways. There's a mystery to that. But it's also so beautiful. And Jesus is so attractive and is the culmination of the beautiful things that we're studying and holds all things together. And so we want our students to have that understanding, and also we would not feel ourselves to be successful if our students were brilliant academicians and did not love Jesus at the end of what we're doing here with them. It's our heart's desire and our prayer that everything that we do here would be pointing them towards him, and that they would find their calling in life to follow him, not in a simplistic way, not in trying to just give them easy answers to things, but to really dig deeply into how Jesus is at the center of everything and holds all things together. Through him, all things were made.
Very helpful distinction you made, that the church, the home, and the school, these three institutions, are all involved in the work of virtue formation, with the school having a particular interest in intellectual virtue. How has that relationship been between those three institutions? Has it felt harmonious with your relationship with churches and relationship with homes? Has there been a sense of a shared language between those three groups?
That's a really great question. I would overall say that it's been a wonderful thing to see the partnership between homeschool and church. I think the challenges are that the expectations on a school have become more and more: serving meals, taking over counseling, becoming the all-encompassing institution in a family's life. And Veritas has not wanted to be that. We've not wanted to replace the church in our families' lives. We don't want to fill their calendars such that they don't have time to be serving in their churches and being involved in their churches. So we're pretty overt about talking about families need to be part of your church. We want to come alongside your family and support you as you raise these children, and that they would grow up to be faithful church members and faithful, loving neighbors, and loving God first and neighbor, and that we want to come alongside what you're doing as a family in a church. I heard someone say, and I kind of like this, that the church is the bride of Christ. The Christian school ought to act like a bridesmaid, right? We're not the main attraction. We're not trying to be the main attraction. We're trying to come alongside and support this. There's a lot I kind of love about that picture. So it's a conversation that is intentional here as a school.
Robyn, just give our listeners a flavour of what Veritas School is like. You're a day school, not a boarding school. How many students? What ages? How long have you been going? Just give us a taste.
Yes, Veritas is 25 years old. We're an independent Christian school here in Virginia, and we are located inside the city of Richmond, which is important to us. We feel like we ought to be for the good of the city. Here we have 680 students from junior kindergarten through 12th grade. On our campus here, we're on one campus with about 5 or 6 buildings and a nice, pretty quad. It's quite a lovely campus. We feel very blessed to have buildings that sort of work with us in our task of drawing our students to beautiful things. So that's a wonderful thing.
Robyn, you're a biologist. Sometimes one of the criticisms of the classical Christian model is that it can be stronger in the written word, the spoken word, and perhaps it's been less strong in the experimental sciences. As a scientist yourself, could you speak to that? Is that a fair criticism? Have you seen that change over time?
I think I would say I've seen it change over time, partly because we've come to a fuller understanding of what kinds of skills we need to be giving our students. We have basic science equipment in our labs, and we don't have a lot of fancy and very expensive things. So if you're using that as your measurement, then we would come up short. But if you instead look at what questions are they asking? What are the basic skills of science in collection of data, in how to think about data, how to make observations and be careful about how you do that, then we're giving our students a really robust science education, and they're going off into universities and going into hard sciences and coming back and telling us that they are very well prepared for those fields because they've learned some skills that are usually behind the scenes in science that ought to be there. They've learned to make connections, and they've also learned to communicate to people and write well and speak well, alongside of the skills that they've learned in math and science here.
And then having that breadth of being able to, for example, root ideas in their positions within history or make links across disciplines, that's a very potent skill for scientists to have. Perhaps a weakness for our system in the UK, in that we can end up narrowing and specialising really quite early. But what you're describing there is keeping a much broader scope until 18, 19, and actually often beyond that in an American context.
That's right.
That's really interesting. This book that we've been discussing, Robyn, the author, he is open at the outset that he's trying to encourage distinctively Christian education to broaden its scope from really an informational model to a formational model of not just what we know, but what we love. And both of those things flowing from a Christian faith. Struck by a phrase you used earlier on of dreaming about what was possible. I'm sure you're speaking to teachers all the time and across the country. Yeah, how might you encourage Christian teachers to think more broadly about not just living as a Christian in education, but actually thinking about education Christianly?
I would have talked about the power of this teacher-student relationship and what is going on in that relationship. It's not simply transactional with skills and information. Of course, teachers are they are training students in skills, and they are giving students information. But more than that, there's the dignifying of the relationship between the teacher and the student. We want to be the kind of teachers that our students should become like. I want to put teachers in the classroom that are the sorts of people that we would want our students to be like someday. And so I would have encouraged you, no matter the setting that you were in, to embrace that relationship with your students in a way that is actually very humbling and a little scary as a teacher. It's one thing to say, well, I'm going to teach the skills of history or the skills of biology and a bunch of content. That's daunting in itself. But if someone says, and now you need to be the kind of person these students are going to become like, that is, it should send us as believers to our knees, asking for the Lord's help in that. But also the power of that, no matter the setting that a Christian teacher is in, to make a difference in a student's life by not just being very skillful as a teacher, but dignifying the relationship and that student. I think helping them to see the ways in which they're gifted by God with capabilities that can be developed, have purpose beyond just being a cog in the machine to go on to university so they can get a good job and be a cog in a new machine. I think dignifying our students in that regard is so important. I think also in our moment right now, even with the talks of AI, it's a huge opportunity for us to take a step back and talk more about the purpose of education, right? What What are the intellectual virtues? Can a machine do those things? If a machine can replace parts of what we're doing, then have we actually not been talking about that as richly as we ought to have been talking about it? And it feels like an opportunity right now.
Robyn, thank you so much for joining us. It's been lovely to speak today.
You're so welcome. It's been a really wonderful time. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you everyone for enjoying this episode of Reframing Education. We exist to open up conversations about Christ-centred education in the UK. We host fortnightly interviews to inspire and equip educators and parents and leaders as we explore the big questions like what is the purpose of education?
Please follow, like, share, leave a review. It all helps to grow the conversation. And do check out the show notes for other ways to support and connect. In particular, you can check out the Patreon for details of our book group. Thank you for listening, and until next time, may God fill education with the colour of Christ as we're drawn to the praise and love of our Creator.